Hey everyone, welcome to the second session of GH-200, Automate Your Workflow with GitHub Actions. I'm Rob Foltrod, a Microsoft technical trainer and longtime MCT in the developer and DevOps space. In this section, we're going to be taking a look at pipelines inside of GitHub Actions. Specifically, what are the tools that GitHub Actions supplies? We won't be looking at individual actions. We won't be looking at a particular action to build a .NET app or a particular action to install a particular version of Node, but we're really looking at the underlying support structures that GitHub Actions will supply to continuous integration and continuous deployment pipelines. Specifically, we're going to be just a quick double down on the definitions so that folks are comfortable with what we're talking about in terms of pipelines. And then we're going to take a look at the idea of environments and some of the support and protection that we get from these environments. Then we will switch into kind of passing data around and environment variables that are going to be necessary to run all of your workflows. And then we'll take a look at artifacts. One of the components that you're going to be doing in a pipeline is producing binaries that are going to be later deployed. We'll need a place for those to be housed and passed from potentially one job to another. Then we will take a look at what does it take to debug, right? Where are we looking if things don't go perfectly the first time? Where are we looking to do those debugs? The very first thing that we're going to be looking at here is just refresh. What are we talking about when we mean a pipeline? What are the pieces that we are going to see inside of a pipeline? So if we look at the development space in general, you're going to go through a process of kind of planning what to build. You will then, that's planning phase, then to go through the development process, write new code, write new support structures, write maybe the bicep or the Terraform files that are going to be deploying all of that, but you're writing that code down and then finally committing that into the code base. At that point in time, then a number of components of the entire pipeline are going to be kicking off. And so these may be done as individual jobs. They may be done as a collection of jobs. We might have one job, for example, that is going ahead and doing some of our early build, that is then running some of our early unit tests, and then generating an artifact that would be used in other environments. Then in here, we may be going from deploying from our CI section into various test servers and deploying code, running test code against said code. And eventually, if all checks out and we are getting success after success after success, then we may start moving them into delivery of those components, pushing that into, say, a staging environment, getting that going, and then finally swapping that over and moving that into production. And then from there, we're looking at kind of in the entire process, going ahead and operating that data and monitoring that data and looping back and doing the whole thing again. But our goal in here is to look at what are the components that we need inside of this pipeline. And the first piece is we'll take a look at this idea of environments. So environments are a logical concept that are applied kind of in the background of your pipeline. In your pipeline, you're going to have sections and say, this section, let's just look at it. You're going to have sections that are going to say, this job, the deploy job, is sitting in an environment named production. So what does that mean? What is that doing? Well, beneath the covers, we can go and build inside of GitHub a definition, a logical definition for what that environment should look like. Are there rules and regulations? Are there policies that need to be in place when something is about to go into production? Probably, right? We probably don't have just any code going into production. There are probably certain requirements if it's going to end up in production. And those rules and regulations, those policies will be different if we are earlier in that pipeline. The rules, for example, we may say in production, only the main branch, the code in the main branch, only that is allowed to be deployed into production, where that requirement doesn't make any sense at all if we are looking at our earlier testing environments. So we get to then, in our pipeline, designate this is a segment that we will call the production environment, and then back in GitHub, we will lay down what those definitions of production or test or staging mean. So inside of GitHub, you're going to go into the settings of your repository. In those settings, you'll go into the code and automation and take a look at the environments section. Once inside of the environments, you will see that by default, you don't have any. Right? There's no magic word. Right? There's no magic idea of production. That's a concept that you are going to bring. Now, it's common that often folks understand what you mean when you say this is a production environment, but you will bring the names of those and you will bring the policies implied. So we go ahead and create a new environment and you simply give it a name that's going to make sense to the folks around you. Once you've built that name, there is no default set of rules or requirements that apply to it. So you will then bring environment protection rules. So those rules can be things like only certain branches can be deployed. Right? Those rules may be that we need to have an approval, that certain humans, before we go in there, may have to say yay or nay, yes or no, this belongs in that environment. So we can have things also like a wait timer, that before we go in there, we have to sit and wait for a certain amount of time. Okay. So this feels a little bit odd for some folks at first, but there are a number of environments where in an earlier environment, we may deploy, and we can't run tests immediately to prove success or failure. Instead, we have to sit and let it bake for a little while. This could be part of your testing process, or it could also be part of your deployment, of your rollout. We may have a ring type deployment in which we deploy maybe to one region initially. And then we sit and we wait, and we ensure that nothing goes wrong. And we might wait for 6 hours or 8 hours, right? You'll see here that we could wait up to 30 days. And then once that is complete, once we're monitoring along the way, once we have seen no real problems, then maybe we go to 2 more regions. And again, we wait, we investigate. And then finally, nothing bad has happened so far. Next phase, or the next. So we might have ring 1, ring 2, ring 3 as the names of our environments. All 3 of those being a production type ring. And we can also have in there branch or tag protection rules. So a branch rule says it has to be from branch A, whether that be maybe you have a release branch and only release is allowed into production. Maybe you have it's just the main branch and only main is allowed in there. So you can specify 1 or more branches that are allowed. Another process that makes a lot of sense to folks is the idea of putting a specified tag. Maybe when you've gone through the testing process, you then tag this as version 1.2.4, whatever. But only branches that have a specific V tag, a version tag on them, might belong in those. Or you could set up no restrictions, right? That anything can go into certain branches, and that might be earlier in the pipeline than later. You can also go and define your own custom rules in there. So you can see from our earlier discussions, we may have reviewers who have to say yay or nay, and then you specify who those reviewers are. You might have a wait timer in there, or we can go and deploy a custom rule set to say what is allowed and what's not. And we'll see some of the tools that are available to us in that custom one in a little bit. But then digging deeper, right, on our deployment branches and tags, we can specify, are we looking for certain branches or are we looking for certain branches and tags? So early on, when you're mapping out what that pipeline is looking like, you'll want to devise, these are the various environments that we may be passing through, and then these are the rule sets. These are the policies that are going to be in place for those environments. When we're working with pipelines, when we're working in a YAML file, you're still not going to escape the idea of this is still a pseudo programming environment. And so we will need some mechanism to store data or variables and make decisions about what's going on inside of those variables. Now, those variables may be ones of your own creation, or there may be ones that are built in. We'll take a look at both. So there's a couple of variables that we're going to see that are built in. They're just hard-coded into the system. So for example, you can see in this example right here, we are deploying to production server on branch GitHub ref. And $GitHub ref is a built-in branch that's specifying what is the branch that we are referring to. And so you don't have to define this, you don't have to work with it, it's just automatically built in there. Right? Whenever you're using these, they will be case sensitive, so you want to be very careful in putting those together. When in doubt, assume case sensitivity when you're working inside of pipelines. There are also a number of built-in objects. Right? And so one of the objects that we are seeing right here is the .github. Right? This is another way of referencing that same idea. And so when we say here github.ref, we are confirming that it is equal to refs/heads/main. Those of you who know the world of Git know that beneath the covers, when we are referring to the main branch, the full and official name of the main branch is refs/heads/main. If you've spent any time in the underlying Git directory, .git directory, you'll see that in the heads directory. It's a little cumbersome. It's a Git thing. It's not really GitHub. But we've got the github.ref. Again, that means the same thing as github_ref, but we'll see that there are a number of attributes that are tied to that GitHub object. In addition to the built-in variables, you also have the ability to create your own. And the way that we build those is through what we're calling environment variables. Those of you who have run applications on a system know that you can often set environment variables on that system. When the application runs, it then reads those variables. That's often a way to pass input into systems. The GitHub runners do that same thing. The GitHub runners will use the idea of environment variables as a mechanism to pass data into the current action that's running. You have an opportunity to place this at a number of different levels. So you can place a variable at the workflow level. You can place one at the job level or at the individual action. So again, the umbrella for the entire workflow, that means every action that's going to run is going to see that. At the job level, a single workflow may have several jobs. And so all of the actions in that job will see it. Or you may be setting it distinctly and individually for an individual action. And so in this example, you see a little of each of those. You will see right here, this day of the week. You get to define, this is your own definition. You can make that whatever you want. And so here we have one being of day of the week. And now take a look at the scope and you'll tell me, you won't, but tell me, what is that scope to? Well, if you look here, we are really at the entirety of the whole thing. So this one here is at the workflow level. We have another environment variable here, nested beneath jobs. And so this one here is set at the individual job level. And then finally, at the bottom here, we see environment that is sitting at the same level as this particular action. Now, it's a little bit confusing for some folks because we've got the run above it. These are not in any way, shape, or form ordered. So you could put them in any order that you see fit. Here, they dropped it at the bottom, so it's easy to read. But we'll see in this final execution here that we are echoing greeting, first name, and day of the week. All of those are available to this particular action because it is in the workflow, it is in that job, and it is, of course, in this action. So 3 different levels when you are building your own. Now, going back to the built-in ones, we saw that there was a GitHub object. We've got a couple others. So the other one that you're seeing here is the runner variable. There are scenarios in which you may have a single job, and that job could be run on several different runners. Imagine you've got an open source project, maybe running on Python, and you know that this product, this Python application, can run on a Windows machine, can run on a Mac, can run on Linux. But there are components that you might want to do slightly differently based upon each one. So same job running on 3 different machines. So you may have to have some sort of if statement in here, like we do on this one. Here we have an if, and we check the runner object, and in this case, the OS property of the runner. And if it's Windows, then you may carry out action A, right? There might be a certain directory structure in which you're expecting this to be in Windows, and if it's not Windows, then a different directory structure, right, for the Mac or Linux systems. One of the things that might be a little bit complicated is how we can, from one action, pass data to the next, right? And we do that also through environment variables. So here we have a run step. And anytime you're doing a run step, I don't know if we've specifically said this, but anytime you're doing a run step, that's you executing a script. Right, so this is going to be Bash typically on Windows and Mac. This is typically going to be PowerShell when we're looking at Windows. But we then have our run activity, our script, and inside of the script, we just have a little echo action. And what that echo action is doing is writing a line, right? We're going to write that line, and we are going to append that line to a super important little object right there called the GitHub _ environment. You can think of that as the collection of environment variables. And so we are at this point, this is the name. This is the value. In a Linux world here, in the Bash world, we want to make sure that those are separated by the equal sign, no spaces on either side there. So action state equals yellow. Action state's the name of the variable, yellow is the value associated with it, and we are appending that into the GitHub environment variables collection. Now that will have no effect while I am in this particular action. So I've seen several folks who have appended that into the action and then on the very next line assumed it to be true, assumed that it was in the variable state. It will not be in the variable state. Not until we move to the next action are we going to see that. But in this case here, inside the run, when we look to the action state, which was that name variable there, $action state, we will in this case get the value yellow. So to pass between the two, we use the GitHub environment object, and we use that append structure. So we've seen right now a couple built-in objects. We have seen the GitHub object, We have seen the runner object. How many more are out there? Well, there's a handful. And I'm not necessarily proud of this next slide. You may want to just pause real quickly. We have a lot of different context objects that we may want to take a look at. Hit the documentation. You're not going to learn this from this particular slide here, but hit the documentation. But you will see that we do indeed have our GitHub object, our runner object. We have so many more in there that are available to us. Where are we in terms of a job, and what steps are we in? Where are we in terms of secrets? Matrices are a mechanism for us to, I talked earlier about being able to run the same job potentially on different runners. One way of doing that is building a matrix and saying, I'd like you to run on several different runners. Right? So we've got a number of different contexts and data allowed for us to then be able to read or change our behavior inside of the workflow due to the values of these. One more, worst slide you'll see all day. They're just diving a little bit deeper into some of these, like the jobs object. What they're mentioning in here is that inside of jobs, each job gives an ID, like build or CI. And then we can refer to jobs from a distance. So we can get to the jobs, specify the job ID, and then read those variables. Again, you're not going to learn this from the slide. Hit the documentation, but it's an important piece that you may need to know in building those actions. So let's imagine that you've performed a continuous integration job. In that CI job, you've validated that the code base is of high enough quality. You've done a build, it's built successfully. All of the basic unit tests, the testing that you can do pre-deployment, it's all passed, it's all been successful. And now you need to generate an artifact that will be used throughout the rest of the pipeline. An important piece, an important kind of concept that we have in the world of pipelines is this idea of an immutable artifact. What we would not want is to deploy artifact A early in our pipeline process, and it validates okay, but then later in the process, accidentally deploy artifact B that wasn't tested early on. Right? So we need a mechanism to be able to create these artifacts that are going to be immutable through the pipeline. We've got a few different ways of doing this. So first, just kind of what are those artifacts? Right? Again, the CI build, when we do our build, it will potentially create the assemblies, the binaries that we need to deploy later in the pipeline. So the first thing that we would do, maybe better said, the last thing in that CI system that we are going to do, once we've gone through we've checked our code out, we've gone ahead and done a build. This is a very, very simple one. But let's imagine that this checks out, all is great, this all is great, nothing bad has happened. Now we want to then take that artifact and store it. We have a very specific action. Actions/upload artifact. This is built into Actions, GitHub Actions. You'll always have an actions/upload artifact action. And here you get to give a name. There may be many cases in which you may upload several artifacts. We may upload the binaries for a particular assembly, but we also might upload maybe the bicep or the Terraform files that are necessary in the deployment. So we could have several of them. So they'll need some sort of name or label. So in this case, our Webpack artifacts is the name. And then where are we going to find them? And so in this case here, we are looking to the public folder. and we will upload the entire contents of that public folder. You have a lot of variation on what you could put in there in terms of specifying an individual file or specifying a file that ends in a particular extension. Any of those would be fine. But here we are uploading the entirety of the public folder. So uploading, that's part one. Then we would need at some point in time to bring those down in later jobs. It's important to recognize that if you're building a pipeline that is composed of multiple jobs, that those jobs are going to be executed, almost guaranteed, are going to be executed on different machines. Each job is going to have its own runner. And so you can imagine that when we go to run a job, we download all of the actions, we download maybe all of the code, we run it. In our last section, we uploaded a file, but then that's, in essence, in many cases, destroyed. It's gone. So the very next time another job runs, we can't count on anything that has happened on that earlier job. It's very likely on a different machine. So here, our next steps are then to download. Now, in this particular job, we are both doing a checkout and a download. That may or may not be necessary. In many jobs, you will be doing one or the other, that you will be downloading the artifacts that have been previously created or checking out your source code. Here, we're doing both. We see both of them in there. Just know that there's a really good chance, in many cases, that you wouldn't want to do a checkout again, because you really want to work with the artifacts that were pre-tested, that were pre-built, and not try to generate your own. But in this case, we've got both of them up there. It's fine. But we see here that we are downloading artifact. Actions/download artifact. And we're specifying the name. In the earlier example, that was Webpack artifacts, and we're specifying where to put those informations when we're done with them. Now, the other part, and I'm swinging back over to this section here, when you have multiple jobs. So let's imagine that I had a CI job, I had a build job, I had a build job, I had a test job, and maybe a deploy job. If you are not careful in GitHub Actions, the default is for all jobs to run at the same time. Which doesn't make a lot of sense if we have dependencies that need them to be strung together. So it's important that you, as the author of the workflow, it's important for you to tell the system, hold up, this particular job, the test job, this is what we're looking at, the test job needs this other job to have completed successfully. If it doesn't, then this shouldn't run. This will serialize. This will bring them in line so that they're not all running in parallel. Running in parallel is great when what you need to do isn't dependent, right? There's a number of situations where you will have maybe some of your build and tests that are done in one job, where you might have another one that's doing maybe some linting, maybe another job that's doing some security tests. And you just need to make sure that all three of them pass, but they don't all have to be done in serial. They can all be run in parallel. That's perfectly fine. But then when we go to the next phase, we may need all three of those to work. So in that scenario, we may have build, comma, and then in here, specify the names of the others. Maybe we have lint going, and we have security going, right? Well, now we are dependent upon all three of those. Right? So I've just seen folks who try to download, right? And it keeps failing, and it's failing because they haven't got that dependency in play. So then we just look at kind of the totality of it, right? So there's not a whole lot that's new in this one. But what we're seeing here is that we have job number one, job number one is going through a little bit of work, right? And it is piping out to a particular file and then uploading that file. We're naming it file, we're specifying a path. Then in job number two, we're just going through. We need job number one to have completed successfully. Then we will download file and then just spill the contents to the screen. When you are running a pipeline in which the pipeline feeds itself, that we early in the pipeline build and create the assemblies, create the binaries that we're going to need, and then later in the pipeline we're going to consume them, what we have seen earlier works just fine. But there are scenarios where we must feed other pipelines. We must feed other tools. And then we have to put the data, we have to put those components in places that are more readily available. And so we've got two of those inside of GitHub that are available to us. Number one is that built in, there is GitHub packages. Now, this is a parallel product that's built inside of GitHub, parallel to that of Actions. And this is a package manager. Package manager could be package manager for, say, NuGet, for .NET, which is NuGet. It might be the package manager for JavaScript, which is NPM, right? That this can be a package manager for all of those available to us. So we may be pushing them out to that package manager. And that package manager could be private to only our product, but we could also be pushing an open source product that other folks could be downloading from. That package manager is also a container registry. So when we are looking at building, say, a Docker container that's going to be consumed from some other system, we also have the ability to build those Docker files and then publish them into GitHub packages. So kind of two opportunities there when we're looking at externalizing the effects of our pipeline, pushing them either to kind of a raw package manager, to an NPM, to a NuGet, to a Maven, or publishing them to the Docker package manager. So if we're using packages, we see a quick little example for what it's going to look like to push that out there. So we start off with we're just doing our build job in here. We're checking out our code. We're going ahead and making sure that Node is set up on the system. We are then running our CI, continuous integration. We're running our tests. So build, everything has succeeded. Lovely. We then have our dependency. So we're dependent upon what was up above. And we're checking out our code. We're again setting up Node. But in this case here, we're doing a little bit extra. And we are specifying that there's going to be a package manager. So when we are when we're talking about our registry URL, when we go to push or pull packages, what is that component? And so in this case, we're using the npm package manager github.com as our package manager. Then we'll go through and run the CI process, and then npm publish, which seems a little bit innocuous, but this publish is publishing to what we set up when we did the setup node process. So at this point, we are then pushing the results of that into that package manager. Now, often you will need to authenticate. So in this case here, we're dipping into our secrets and grabbing our GitHub token. So GitHub token is a well-known secret that is loaded up with the rights and privileges of the pipeline itself. So we're passing those onto the publish aspect, which will then be validated against that source. Now it's available for other pipelines, for other tools to be pulling this package from. Same with Docker. Right? We've talked about the idea. We have a container registry, that we may have a Docker file that's going ahead and doing a build. And now we're going to be pushing that container registry. So in here, we will have to go through authentication. Often what we will do is, again, take that GitHub token we saw earlier, and we are then setting that up to the Docker login process. So built into the runners, you will have Docker. And we are then, in essence, doing that authentication up front. Then we can go ahead and tag our image and then push the image up to that registry. Both techniques are equally valid, right? Depends upon what you're putting together. If you're putting together packages that will be consumed by an application, great. If we are putting together these external systems, Docker containers, then this one may be a little bit more appropriate. All right, so we've done a lot so far on the initial creation of our binaries and done a little bit of testing, and now it's time to push them where they belong. How do we get them into their final destination? And so we'll look at the deployment opportunities. Now, deployment is a huge topic, right? That we couldn't possibly, in this little tiny section, discuss how to deploy to Azure and to AWS and to Google Cloud and on-prem, and there's so many different opportunities. But what we do know is that there should probably be an action that can do that. So as we discussed earlier, go take a look at GitHub Marketplace. In the Marketplace, you're going to find a ton of actions. Here we've specifically discussed inside of Azure. We've got a number of actions specific to interacting with Azure, and you will find those for related clouds as well. So the core of there should be an action for that doesn't change, right? So that's still part of it. So in your repository, go through the Marketplace, find the ones that are related to you. In this scenario here, we're going to be taking a look at, so what does it take to deploy to, say, an Azure resource? And you can see a pretty simple recipe for putting that together. Let's just kind of dissect this a little bit. We're seeing, again, we now have the name of our job, deploy to Azure. We're going to run that on Ubuntu, and we need ahead of time that we have built an image and pushed that into a Docker container. So that has to have already succeeded. Awesome. Now it's time to deploy this into Azure. So what do we have to do? Well, the first thing that we have to do is authenticate ourselves. So there is, in this case, a login step. Azure_login. Earlier we saw actions / actions is built by the GitHub Actions team. Here we are looking at Azure / well, that's supported by the Azure team. They're responsible for building those actions. So they built us a component to Azure login, which is doing the AZ login routine. So then we are passing in, you can't log in without some sort of credentials, so we're passing in some sort of credentials. We'll talk about secrets coming up momentarily, but just now know that there are secrets sitting in there. This is our own term. You will often see Azure credentials, but it's nothing magic. It's just a key name in there. So we are logging in to Azure. That's step one. Here we're logging into the Docker registry that we published to earlier. So here we've got Azure Docker login. And then we are saying this is the name of the server that we're going into, and this is the username and the password combination that we're putting in here. Using that GitHub object that we talked about in earlier sections, and then again dipping into our secrets and grabbing the built-in GitHub token. So now we can get to both pieces. We can get to where we want to be, and we can get to where the data is currently, where our assembly is currently. And so in this case here, we're dipping into a third component. That is the web deploy. So you could see Azure /, so it's the Azure team that's doing this, and we're doing a web apps deploy. Inside of Azure, we've got a great PaaS service there called Azure Web Apps, and we are pushing into that location. We're then supplying the details. The name of the app is probably up top, earlier in the product, earlier in the workflow, Okay. The image was defined earlier. This is the image that we pushed into Docker, right? So we're then pulling that out. And that does the deploy, right? Again, it will be different for the myriad of resources that we have inside of Azure. You will be swapping out what this component here is, but much of the others will be similar. And then finally, we're doing a logout. How crucial is that step? It depends on what we're doing and what our runners are. It's not a bad step to have in there. If you are running in a GitHub hosted runner, then everything just gets cleaned up anyway. Still not a bad practice. If you are running on a self-hosted runner, this may be a little bit more important in those scenarios to make sure there's no carryover going on. But those secrets that we talked about. Secrets is one of the built-in objects that we can use inside of our application. And we've got a couple of different levels where secrets could be. In this scenario here, we're seeing that we have logged into the settings for our repository. In those settings, we have then dipped into secrets and variables. And you'll see up top here, we have both secrets and variables. The difference being, is this something that someone could see in clear text? If you put something in the variables section, if there was some sort of log that was showing the results, and it was in a variable, the value may appear in the log. Okay. And when someone goes to edit it, they will see what was originally there. If we put something inside of secrets, and here we have two secrets. There's that Azure credentials that we just saw a second ago, and Azure subscription ID. If I were to go into those Azure credentials and go try to edit what is there, there is no edit. There's only replace. So when I open it up, it'll be empty. I could supply a new value, but I won't be able to see what the older value was. That's different with variables. So now we have a secrets credentials and a secrets subscription ID. And if we just dip back just a little bit, right, to our earlier example, here we're then referring to it. More specifically, if we look at the whole thing, it would be $, double curly brace, secrets dot, and then that Azure credentials that we saw. And so to see that in practice, we can see here, again, very similar to what we saw earlier. We have our login, and then here we are referring to those credentials. Specifically, the whole bit would be $, double curly, secrets dot Azure credentials. Once we've started with this idea of deployment, or really anywhere in our pipeline, really, I suppose, we may want a mechanism to show the status of that particular pipeline or that phase of the pipeline. And a common practice is in the README file, right? And so in GitHub, many repositories will have, in the root directory, we'll have a README file. And in that README file, we are supposed to show what we need to know about that particular repo. Well, one of the things that we may want to illustrate is, how's the pipeline doing? Are we succeeding or failing when the pipeline is running? Well, traditionally, that's a kind of a complicated thing to do in a static file like a README. You can't update it. You don't want to be updating the README file every time a pipeline runs. You then write the status to that file. That feels a little bit uncomfortable. So there's a really neat process where we can specify a workflow status badge. And so in this particular scenario, this is a little blurb of text that is going to be static inside the README. The text, example branch parameter, great. But you'll notice here, we are then referring, this is the URL that we're referring to, github.com/ the organization or the owner of the repository, the name of the repo itself, actions, workflow, then the name of the workflow. Right? So that's not going to change out from underneath us. And then specifically, we tack on to the end of it badge.svg and perhaps even a specific branch. This could be the workflow branch or the dev branch or the production or the release branch. And the underlying graphic that is being downloaded here will change. So the text can stay the same, the underlying badge itself will change, resulting in something that looks like this. For branch my workflow, we then have whether we are passing or failing, depending upon the status of the last run of that particular workflow. So in this scenario here, when we're looking at the grading workflow, we can see the last thing that happened, little green check there, last thing that happened was a success. Therefore, we end up with a passing. Let's imagine we didn't, though. Let's imagine that there's some issue. Where are we going to go for that? Well, every time a workflow executes, it will generate the run logs. And so here, for our node CI job, we have several different individual runs. In this case, the runs happen to be running perhaps on different systems. We've got maybe a matrix that's going, and in that matrix we're running on Ubuntu, and we're running on Windows, and we're running a couple different versions of Node. Nice little matrix happening there. But we can see that they are kind of differing outcomes for each one of those. So we may have to delve into and say, well, what's going on? Why are we failing on this test build? And then we dip into the logs itself. Simply click on the element, and you will see each one of the actions and then the underlying details for said action. And so in this case here, when this one ran, we ran into a little directory issue that, hey, we couldn't find that particular directory. What's supposed to be null. Right? We now have the error messages, and we can start investigating what was going on from there.
All right, folks. So up to this point, we've done a lot of talking, but we haven't done a lot of showing when it comes to the CI/CD concepts inside of GitHub Actions. So we're going to take a look at this small application here. We've got another application. In this case, it's a .NET application that has a quick little web app in there and some components to deploy. So we'll do a little bit of CI work. We'll validate the application, and then we will push it into Azure. So for all of this to start, we will again need an action. So I'm going to dip into actions here. Doesn't really matter which one I click here because I've got one of my own. So we'll just set up our own workflow. And then to keep things reasonably quick, I will drop one in and I will commit the changes. That will start this up and running, and then we'll come back and take a look at it. So we will do a quick little commit here. I'm committing directly to the main branch. Not a great idea, but this is a demo, so we will we'll get by. So right now it's running in the background, but let's take a look at the YAML file here to see what's happening. So on our triggers here, we have kind of our standard triggers. We do have a manual trigger if we happen to need it. We have anytime a pull request is being made to either main or develop. And then we've got a push here anytime we are pushing to a particular branch, either main or develop, or, and this is a little bit new here, anytime we're adding a tag that has the prefix of release in it. Anytime we're tagging that, usually for the releases feature that's inside of GitHub. So we'll take a look at that. You'll see up at the top, we are starting off with a nice little variable section. This section right here is at the workflow level, so that will filter into all of the other jobs that we have up and running. And some could argue that maybe some of these don't necessarily need to be at the workflow level, right? Those could be perfectly appropriate at the job level as well, but sometimes it's more convenient to see them up top so we know what we're working with. It's kind of up to your discretion. But we're going to have a series of jobs. This one has 4 jobs, actually. The first job is build and test. And inside of build and test, we are going and checking out the entire code base. we'll skip over this for just a second. We got a couple things in here, but we are then going and setting up .NET. We said it was a .NET application. Right. Then we are going through and uploading the artifacts. So you can see right here, we've done a publish, .NET publish. And again, this is a .NET application. It doesn't really matter what kind of application. We're going through the same concepts all along the way. So in this case, we are generating our artifacts. This is the build. And then here, as we talked about in the module, we are then using the upload artifact to store this for later jobs. Eventually, we will have to deploy something. We'll want to make sure that that is saved for later. We are also uploading, in this case, any of the code coverage files that we may need for later on. So here you can see we're doing 1, 2, 3, 4 different uploads for this one particular job. So that's job 1. Job 2, and we'll go quickly through this. Job number 2 here is looking at the infrastructure. There's a bicep file that is deploying the resources that we will need in Azure. So in this particular job, we're going through and we are checking out just the infrastructure folder. Action checkout. We're doing a sparse checkout. We're just grabbing the infrastructure folder. And we're doing a little bit of linting on our bicep files. Nothing crucial, nothing huge, but at least a nice step to make sure that there are no syntax errors in our bicep files. Once we have those, we are also uploading those artifacts. Action, upload artifact. That's job number 2. Job number 3, we're then running a security scan. More details on the security scan in the GH-200 course when we're looking at advanced security, but at least running through and making sure we don't have a lot of security issues inside the code base itself. Once all 3 of those are complete, once all 3 of those are finished, we will then potentially run the deploy job. You'll notice right here that we have a dependency on each one of those 3 up above, on build and test, on package of infrastructure, and on the security scan. If any of those fail, this job won't run. We're also putting another qualifier on deploy. We are making sure that this happens to be a push, and we have added a tag that starts with release. If that's not true, this deploy job will not run. We'll also see in this deploy job here that we have an environment. Right? One of the other things that we talked about in that section is the setup work for defining environments. Now, in many pipelines, you will go through many environments. Here, I just have a production environment. And so you can see the call to that production environment, but I don't have it defined in this project. So that's what I have to do right now. We're gonna leave the code base here, and we're gonna go define that production environment. I'm gonna swing up to the top here, and we will go to the settings section. So inside of settings, we'll swing down to environments, and we will see that initially we have one in case Copilot's doing any work, right? Defining something for Copilot specifically. But for our application, our pipeline, we don't have anything. So I'll define a new environment. We'll give that the same name. Call that production. Double checking my spelling here. Good. All lowercase. You do want to make sure that those are a case-sensitive match. And we will configure. Now we have a production environment. That's it. That's the association that the workflow says, hey, I'm in the environment production. Now we have it defined. So in this production environment, we can go and set up some of the rules. So for example, we can say, hey, I want someone to make sure that prior to this running, that someone has performed some sort of review. Now there's only me in here, so I will pick me. I will be the only reviewer. And in the real world, we really want to be checking that box. That box says that if I am the one who initiated the workflow, then I can't be the one to review. Well, since it's only me, we're not going to get very far if I do that. But in the real world, really important that we have a different person validating this. Well, we can also go in, and we'll save these rules here. We can also go in and set up some restrictions on what can be deployed. So in this case here, we'll say that we don't want just any branch to be added. So we will add a rule that says only the main branch can be deployed into production. Add that rule. And we very specifically earlier said it has to be a release tag. So I will add that as well. We'll go up and say, hey, we're looking for a tag, release, and then something after it, release star. So those are our two rules now for our environment. Okay. If we swing back to our action, I am hoping that when we look at the run that just happened, right, when we added the file, we should see 3 out of the 4. Yeah, this is looking good, right? That our build took place, our package infrastructure took place, our security analysis, all of that took place. Those 5 artifacts have been uploaded. There were 4 that were in the CI build, and then our infrastructure gave us a 5th. So lists out 5. Those are all listed down below. If you want to take a look at them, we can see and download any of those 5, but they can also be used further on in the pipeline. So all of that is looking really good. So now we can take a look at deploying. So let's swing into the workflow one more time and see what we're going to need for our deploy. So when we go to deploy all of this, like down here at the very bottom, we are going to need to log in to Azure. We have a very specific action right here that's logging in to Azure. And in this case, in my Azure subscription and in my tenant, I have a managed identity already there that already has the correct permissions. So we need then the tenant, which is the Entra ID tenant in which that managed identity lives. We need the subscription, the Azure subscription, and then we need the ID of the managed identity itself, the client ID. So those are supposed to be inside of secrets, and as of right now, they're not. So if I run this right here, we'll just run into a problem with those being empty. So let's swing back into inside of settings. We will then swing down to secrets and variables. And in secrets and variables, we have a section here for actions. So this section here is for all actions that are going to run in this particular repository. And we can go ahead and create new secrets specific. Now, it might not be appropriate that every single action that runs in this particular repo has or should have access to those secrets. It may be that only certain repos or in certain environments. So in our case here, we're talking about a production environment. It makes a lot more sense not to have this as a repo secret, but as an environment secret. So I'm swinging into environment, swinging into production, and then we'll swing down to the bottom here where we have environment secrets. So I'm going to pause real quick and then add those secrets in, and we'll be right back. All right, we are back. We have added those 3 secrets that were defined as being required at the workflow. Those have been added specifically for this particular branch or this particular environment. And then we can go into our code and we can go add a tag. So we're going to create a new release here. This is going to be that release tag that should start this whole thing running. So we will go and create a new tag, release version 1. We'll call that release version 1, and we will publish. This should start the actions one more time. This is going to take a couple of minutes, so we will again pause real quick and then take a look at the results. All right, it's been a couple of minutes now, and we can see here that the protection rules are in place. You saw a moment ago that when we added the production environment, that we added a reviewer. And so here we can see the requirement for a review. I'll go ahead and review. In the real world, I should spend some time actually looking at the code and making sure that everything is okay here, but I will approve and deploy. Now we are starting on part 2 of all of this. This will also take a couple of minutes. We will pause and resume shortly. All right, so now we've spent a couple of minutes waiting, and you can see here that we have successfully deployed into Azure. Just so that you see a little bit of what was created here. We have the bicep file created a series of resources for us, specifically created a web app. That web app is what houses our deployment, and then we pushed our simple application, in this case, into production. Now, we're going to take a brief look at a couple other little details in here, and then we will wrap all of this up. But if we are looking at the action, one other component that we just want to bring a little bit of attention to was this ability to share data or variables between individual actions. So one small example right here is we have just a little bash script, and that bash script is going and generating, in this case, what's called a build ID. It could be any data, any variable. A script is doing some form of work and then generating some data that might be needed later on in the pipeline. In this scenario, we're just making up this idea of a build ID. So it's taking the word build on there, checking on the date, and then throwing the run number on there. So that's just a little bit of data sitting inside that bash script. What we're seeing right here is we are then echoing that out. We have created a variable here called custom build ID and tacked on said build ID, and we're putting it inside of what we talked about in the module, the GitHub environment. You'll also see right away that we are displaying that environment variable there, custom build ID. And as I wrote here in the note, we are not expecting that to work. Right? It isn't going to be available to us in this particular action. It's not until the next action, if we scroll down, not until this next action are we going to be able to see the results. So we are then grabbing the custom build ID. It is now available to us, and then we are printing it out. All right. From there, we are also, we had a brief discussion of some of the objects and environment variables that are available to us inside of any given action. For example, what is the runner? And we are using the OS runner environment variable or the context object. And we're running through a series of those, as you can see here on the screen. You can pause if you're interested in looking at them in detail. But the results of those, when we go take a look, you can see that we generated the ID. This is where the build, the bash script generated all the little shell script. And so it generated that value. But when we are looking at custom build ID locally, it's not available to us yet. Not until the next action, when we read that same thing, is the build value there. Right? And then continuing all of those additional variables. You can see the runner OS. This is running on a Linux box, and you can see the rest of the variables and the values that are displayed. Right, I hope that was helpful. And let's go wrap all of this up.
This has both been a lot and just the beginning at the same time. We've talked about a bunch of things. We've talked about the idea of pipelines. We've talked about that pipelines may have several environments that they are pushing to. Environments are these logical conventions that allow us to place policies. So we can say certain things like, we are defining this pipeline as going into production. Therefore, because it's going into production, these are the rules for any code that might be pushed that direction. It might have to be approved by a certain person, might have to have a particular tag. It might have to wait for so long before we move on to another. We talked about the types of data that we are going to be passing around, both the native GitHub objects that are built in and your own variables that you may be using in your pipeline. We've looked at where we're going to put artifacts, where they're going to go, and we saw there were really 3 different areas that they could go into: the pipeline repository, right? The pipeline data, which is using the upload artifact and download artifact. And that works well within a pipeline, but when we need to go beyond a single pipeline, then we may look at publishing to something like GitHub packages, both assemblies and what typically are like dependencies that would go there, and Docker images. And then finally, we looked briefly at the idea of, well, now what? Where is our deployment going to look like? And the answer is, there's probably an action for that. We saw a scenario where we were looking specifically for Azure, but there are the same for AWS, for cloud, or for components that are going to be running on-prem. I'm Rob Fulkrod, and I hope this has been helpful, and hope to see you in the next one.